on Josh's story earlier, it was that they made the walkway between when they deplaned people and where they picked up their bags, they made that longer so that people were taking their time. They had to get there. By the time they got there, their bags were already there. Same thing with like elevators. If the elevators are mirrored, people don't complain about having to wait as much. I just sit and look at myself. Anyway, design tricks. Okay. So in 1966, at a dinner party in New York City, Lloyd Morissette, this guy who was the president of the Markle Foundation, found himself in a conversation with a woman named Joan Gans Cooney. She was a producer at WNET, which is, I think it's WNET, New York's channel 13 public broadcasting station. And they started pondering this question, because Lloyd was telling this story about how his two young daughters seemed to be able to remember the jingles from commercials on Saturday morning cartoons easier than they could remember the things that they were learning in kindergarten, first grade, etc. So he thought, I wonder if we could use music to help teach kids. And she said, you know what, that's interesting. Also, kids seem to really be paying attention to this new screen that is becoming ubiquitous in homes, that is television, starting to show up in more and more homes. And they wondered together whether they could master the addictive qualities of television and potentially with music too, and do something good with them. And from that dinner party, they went out, they raised some money, they had more conversations, they brought different kinds of people together into a room, and they started thinking about what this could be. Now, the climate at the time was really important too, because there was this guy named Newton Minow. He was the chairman of the FCC, and you can look it up. He made this public speech called the Vast Wasteland speech. That's what it ended up being called, where he said, television is a vast wasteland. It is all formulaic. The commercials are constantly cajoling oftentimes kids to buy things. All of the programming follows the same formula. The cartoons are full of violence. This thing needs some help, all right? We are not getting what we need to get out of this really powerful new technology and medium. So Lloyd and Joan brought together a whole bunch of people, and they started putting together some tests, little tiny micro chunks of content that they designed together with school psychologists and curriculum designers, with child therapists who had worked with kids in abusive homes. They worked with musicians and started to create what they hoped might be the kind of material that could be displayed on television to teach kids. They put kids and kids in the urban environments that they were really targeting to try to get those urban kids learning at the same level and competitive with their suburban, more affluent counterparts. Put them in front of TVs, and they watched, and they changed little bits and pieces of the content over and over again to really figure out whether or not the kids were learning. Each of these pieces of content had some defined measure of success, like the kid would start counting, or the kid would start saying the next letter in the alphabet. And they kept going back and forth like this, changing little tiny elements of every piece of content. And this is really one of the things that I want to talk about today, is that as they were testing these little bits and pieces, they started to learn that the kids were more likely to trust the content and learn from the content if the content felt more like the kind of environment that the kids were used to already. So it wasn't just about teaching curriculum, but it was about using the little elements of a kid's daily life and some of the things they might be afraid of and some of the things that represent their peers and some of the things that represent authority in the content itself. So what do you think this program is? It was actually written at some point in the program here, and I was like, oh shit, you gave away the punchline. I shouldn't have given you the name of it, but yes, it's Sesame Street. Okay, gold star, Sesame Street. So this is how Sesame Street started, with like $2 million in 1969. In November, it aired on public broadcasting. no advertising, no major networks, and it is a global brand today. And the way the set was even designed was to reflect the context in which these kids were generally experiencing their lives. So things like the stoop had dirt on it because that's what it couldn't be a shiny set. That's why the characters all had a little bit of stuff on them because that was how the kids were experiencing. The kids that they were trying to target were experiencing their lives day to day. That's why Oscar the Grouch lives in a trash can, because trash cans were part of their lives along the street day to day. And those curriculum designers, by the way, why puppets are part of this is because those child therapists said that kids from abused homes are more likely to respond to a sock with eyeballs on it attached to a human than to the human who's actually talking to the child. That is the kind of audience that is already, even at these young preschool age, are already different kinds of emotional audience members than we might naturally think. We're trying to design for them. And so what ended up happening is that Sesame Street had to find the right mix of the puppets, which represented the child's consciousness, and the humans, which represented authority, to figure out when, and timing-wise, and for which kinds of segments to have each on TV so that the kids could learn. So what I'm going to show you now is another example of some early testing that they did. This is a very young James Earl Jones counting to 10. Ready?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
In the background, you might have noticed there were cars honking. Did you notice that? That's the kind of stuff that this team was doing. They were also testing the amount of time between numbers. They found that 4 seconds the kids would lose attention, 2 seconds wasn't long enough for them to start learning. When he waited 3 seconds in between each number in the sequence, the kids would start saying the next number in the sequence out loud. And that's how Sesame Street developed all of its content, taking these micro chunks with small use cases that could be tested. And so they started with 2 main goals: get kids counting to 10 and get them knowing their ABCs. That's how Sesame Street started. Only after they had developed the process of taking these tiny goals, working with the content, working with the context in which kids were experiencing their lives, and embedding that into the design of the program itself, did they start scaling it to new populations, like the electric company, trying to do that same formula with an older population, 7 to 9-year-olds. Then as things started to move into the 90s and 2000s, how did they start taking that material and start adapting into gaming technologies, into new physical and digital games that interacted? This is an AR/VR game. They also started moving into different kinds of content in the programming after they found that the Mr. Hooper episode, which is Mr. Hooper was a cast member who died in real life of old age, and Mr. Hooper still to this day, that episode where they confronted death on Sesame Street and they talked about death, is still the most popular episode ever. But they didn't start there. They started with numbers and letters, and then they moved into things like divorce and to natural disasters, talking about rebuilding cities after Hurricane Katrina. And just last year, they released an autistic character. They grew from these roots, from these small roots. And as you heard from Josh earlier around things when we get into these new technologies, it's setting these expectations and using the existing conditions. In fact, in the case of AI, the disillusionment we might feel by having something like Siri ask me anything, and then asking her something that she can't answer, and that giant gap being really disappointing. We have an opportunity to kind of set the expectations early on and be able to grow as the technology grows, as it becomes more ubiquitous in people's lives, just like Sesame Street did as one example. And that's especially powerful if we can embrace the emotion of the end user, of the person on the other side, and consider the context of their everyday lives. Be able to use that emotion as a design material, because if we can do that, we can establish the trust that's absolutely essential, the trust that kids needed to have in order to be able to believe the material that was coming through the television, and then be able to drive behavioral change so the kids could actually learn, and then the roots of learning get deeper. That trust is foundational to driving behavioral change. And emotion is so, so powerful. It's such a powerful piece of the designer's toolkit. That's something that we started with when we, being Capital One and the conversational AI design team that I lead, set out to design what now is known as Eno. This is Capital One's gender-neutral intelligent assistant, the only gender-neutral intelligent assistant at any US bank, by the way. Eno is one spelled backwards. Nobody likes that? Just me? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, all right. Anyway, we started out, again, with a very small use case of giving people their balance and enabling them to pay their bill over SMS. 2 years ago when we set out, it was 8 weeks and 28 people to create a prototype of what Eno could be. SMS is the most ubiquitous channel. Anybody with a mobile phone is able to text, so any of our customers would be able to use Eno. That's how we started, with can I get my balance and I need to pay my bill. That was it. It grew from there. Along with those functional use cases, we also developed a whole bunch of jokes, which tend to be money puns, okay? But we started to build in some of the humanity around Eno, and also created several different ways of saying I'm sorry, like error messages. Hey, I'm sorry, I can't understand that quite yet, but the more you talk to me, the more I learn, so you've just made me a little bit smarter, some of that kind of stuff to try to bridge the gap between what Eno was able to do at launch and what Eno and what customers might be expecting Eno to be able to do. Because we started in SMS and then we grew from there, we moved into our web and mobile application, we started learning how customers wanted to talk about money differently depending upon the modality. So this is an example of the message that we have available to customers when they are looking at Eno in the mobile application. And you can see here it says, I'm new, so I typically respond best to short requests. That was language we added because when people moved into, or I'm sorry, the web application, when people moved into the desktop application, they started giving us their life story because they could like type, oh, I'm going traveling on this, it's going to be so great. And Eno was like, I don't know how to do this. I have been used to thumb typing, right? So Eno was optimized for quick responses, thumbs up, emojis, that sort of thing. And then as we moved into new channel, Eno was having a harder time understanding. So we had to set the expectation. Hey, can you please give me shorter requests? And like, here's a few examples of shorter requests that I'm really good at answering to try to bridge that gap. One of the things that's true about AI is similar to TV in the 60s, is that we have to balance that functional and the emotional side of the work that we're doing. There are two sides to conversational AI, the task completion or productivity side and the emotional side. You need both to truly realize the promise of AI, and that's what this EVP of AI and Research, Harry Shum, said at Microsoft. This other quote, I think, grabs it too. These conversations evoke emotion and lead to relationships rooted in trust, empathy, and understanding. They create an experience that has customers paying attention with their hearts and their minds. And, okay, this is the director of conversational AI at my team. Okay, that's what she said, so I'm being really biased about this. But this is the heart of what any, I think, great design work, and again, I'm biased, but I believe that this is the heart of what is any great design work. It's a diversity of thinking, just like Sesame Street did, bringing multidisciplinary kinds of folks around the table, people who normally wouldn't be in a room together to confront something that has a clear vision about that. And for ours, it is, how do we help people be better with their money? So the thing is, Money is the functional side in case of Capital One. Money is transactional, right? So we might start designing for use cases that look like this. Our customer's asking, when is my bill due? Or they might type BAL. Things that are very transactional in nature. I need to move money, I want a credit limit, those are kinds of things. So we design for that, but the truth, of course, is that people are emotional. They're not transactional. Businesses are transactional. Technology is transactional. People are emotional, and that's the opportunity. So people would tell us those same transactional kinds of statements in this way. I'm afraid to ask my balance. Why don't I ever have enough money, I just got a fraud alert and I'm scared somebody stole my identity. I'm overseas, I'm locked out of my account, I can't pay, sad face. What's the meaning of life? Can I get an extension? I get paid Friday, I swear I'll pay you back. I just got paid, holla! These are actual verbatims from our customers right now. They illustrate the color of life, how people are moving through their life, and how money is an enabler, in some case, a disabler. If we're not able to meet them and understand them and hear the stories and be able to infer from the stories what they need and actually assist them, because that's the promise of AI, is to actually be an assistant. As Chimmy said, to actually know what you don't know, but be pretty sure that it would be helpful if we took care of it for you and give you the control to fix it later. That's the kind of just a little pressure release that's going to help you get through your day a little more. That's the promise of this. And as we start thinking about how Eno can be more emotional, we start adding animation, we start bringing more of the character to life. Even though Eno is gender neutral, we chose that because we want to manifest the values of our company in a way so that people could imagine whatever they wanted to imagine this relationship with the assistant, that we wouldn't be prescriptive about that. So it's really heartening as a designer to see these kinds of feedback loops. These are measures of success. The number of ways that people say thank you. The number of ways that people say I love you. Even people who say I love you, bro. And you know that they're forming this relationship that you left open to their imagination, that they're starting to trust this thing. And it shows up in the ratings. When we get it right, when we're balancing these two parts of every great design interaction. So I'm going to leave you with a little anecdote. One of the things that Eno does is sends out a notification in a few different use cases that, as Josh was talking about, we're looking across patterns, your spending patterns, other people's spending patterns, and we're going, that's weird. It looks like you were just double charged the exact same amount at the same vendor. That might have been a mistake. Or your subscription just went up. Or the tip that you normally leave at a restaurant was not the tip that you just left at that restaurant. You just left a huge tip. So we're just going to send out a quick note. Eno's going to say, hey, did you mean to do this? Is this really what you meant to do? And so we did that for this person. This is a buddy of mine. He was in a different city. He was going to board meetings, and his wife, who's an authorized user of his credit card, was in the same town with him, and she had traveled with him, and she was out shopping. So he got an alert from Eno, and just making sure that this is, in fact, spending that's correct on your account, and you know about it. So we may have to turn the volume up even a little bit more for this one. It's a little, there's some background noise, but just like really focus on this person's voice.
What's your name?
Lloyd Morissette.
Lloyd, how did you feel when your wife bought all those things while you were in the board meetings and then you got an email asking you to approve the transactions?
Well, I was really glad to get the email and know that Capital One was on the ball in checking fraud. I had no problem because all I had to do was press one button and said, yes, I do recognize those transactions.
They make you feel good?
It made me feel pretty good. I thought that we were safe.
Thank you. Also, do you think Steph Hay is like the coolest person ever? Why are you hesitating?
I have to think about that.
Jerk. Again, like that's the kind of feedback loop. I felt safe. Capital One was on the ball. those are the kinds of things that as a designer, and especially in a space like this, where things are always moving at all times, and with AI, machine learning, we can pay attention to those things, and if we just design to help people on the other side and take into consideration their emotional state, in this case, that it might have actually been fraudulent activity, what do we need to do in that moment to help somebody feel a little bit better about the situation right now? Those are the kinds of things that make me feel really good as a designer. By the way, does anybody recognize that person? All right, let me take it back a little bit. Does this help? Does this help? Yeah, that's right. So that's Lloyd Morissette, the co-creator of Sesame Street, who is a Capital One customer. And Lloyd, to Chimmy's point about having diversity as part of your circle, Lloyd is somebody you might think, well, he's a co-creator of Sesame Street. He probably doesn't have to worry about money. But Lloyd worries about money, and in fact, he gave us a new acronym that we didn't know called ROOM, Running Out of Money, which is something that he and his peers, the community where he lives, talk about. And that's the kind of thing that, again, emotional state, who are we designing for, and what are the kinds of patterns that we can use to help create better experiences? Those are the kinds of things that are our design material. So if we embrace it, we embrace that emotion when we're designing for AI, but designing in general, we're really be in a better position to establish trust, which is really what behavioral change is all about for both sides, for both the end user and for the designer too. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah.
So I think when we think about that emotional connection, you often think, especially hearkening back to Sesame Street, think about character.
Oh, yeah.
And we've all had that moment with conversational interfaces where these machines that are trying to have human character fall short.
Yeah.
And so how do you think about striking that balance between like letting machines be machines and letting them feel like computational versus trying to imbue them with something that feels human and may fall short?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm a big fan of being explicit, whether it's in the design of it, the design itself, or just straight up. Hey, I am, like Eno, for example, will say, I'm available 24/7 because unlike a human, I don't have to sleep. And that's the way that Eno's able to convey, I'm not a human, but doesn't start the conversation like that because we're like in some way, self-conscious that you might think it's a human. Like the natural reaction, especially when you're interacting with your bank, is that you are in fact in a 24/7 chat kind of environment, interacting with a human on the other side. So I think in the design itself, there are ways that we can manifest that it's not a human, and we should, for transparency and trust with the end customer, without saying, I'm not a human, but just setting up the expectation that this is a brave new world that we live in. And the thing that I'm always we talk about it a lot in the work that we're doing, but I'm always a little torn on is the attempting to represent oneself as a human. And when I think about like Alexa and Siri are not necessarily doing that, right? But with the gendered voice and being able to, like the troubling thing is watching how people respond to that. I have fears around representing gender and humanity kinds of assistance when interactions are definitely going to fail. So I'll use a specific example just so it's not so generic, which is kids who yell at their Alexa, Alexa, shut up, and like as a parent, I mean, we've done a lot of research and the parent's like, don't talk to Alexa, but why wouldn't you talk to Alexa? Because Alexa doesn't have feelings, but then it's setting up this weird behavioral pattern where like I'm allowed to yell at, in this case, a woman who is not, or a representative of a woman who is not satisfying my needs. And it starts to raise some real interesting social, ethical questions that I think the more we can move into transparency on what this thing is and get into more gender neutrality or intersectionality of having the kinds of behavioral patterns reinforced in real life as we're interfacing with them, the better. So that's like a roundabout way, but the bottom line is being upfront about not being human, because as we start to move into humanity, or being human, the disconnect between being able to deliver that and where we're at right now is just too great, and I fear for what we're actually imbuing.
Yeah, very much. And I mean, have you found any, like, hearkening back to Chimmy's talk about, like, have you found any differences in terms of how different populations or people in different kind of cultural contexts respond to Eno? Have you broken down any kind of research in that way?
Yeah, so great question. One of the things that we were really surprised about were how many people in what we would get, like in the above 55 category were using Eno over SMS. And the most interesting thing about that was when we were doing research with customers, they felt proud of being able to interact with their bank on SMS because they tended to have learned how to text from their kids or their grandkids. So there was this, like, look, I can do this thing, and then they can go back and talk to their kids and grandkids about how they're doing that, and they're like, it was this emotional connection to the channel and the interaction itself. But one of the other, like I would say, demographic differences is being able to use voice to text, which is what we do, has been able to make especially unbanked populations who are in more remote areas be able to access their banking. And that wouldn't necessarily be the case if we started in voice, where we would have a harder time, ostensibly with the technology still what it is, understanding inflection or differences in tonality and that sort of thing that come from like an Alexa, it's just a device sitting on your kitchen counter for the most part. Anyway, so staying in plain text, trying to stay in plain text also makes it most accessible to folks, and also for translation, which we have not gotten into. Capital One is largely in the United States and also Canada, in which case we actually have one of our designers here from Canada here. Anyway, in the UK, but really an English population is still our largest population base,
Right.
But translation services would be easier in plain text as well. So,
Great.
Anyway.
Well, thank you so much, Steph.
Yeah. Thank you.